Hi folks, my name is Ismay and I use they, them pronouns.
And my name is Aiden and I use she, her pronouns. Today we're going to be discussing the sixth call to justice to all Canadians from the final report on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. The National Inquiry's vision is to help Indigenous women, girls, and 2SLGBTQQIA people reclaim their power and place. The National Inquiry has listed calls to justice for the Canadian government and individuals to bring to life to address the disproportionate amount of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA people through the importance of Indigenous ways of knowing, doing, and being.
Before we get started, we think that it is vital that we address our positionality in relation to this issue. We are both white queer settlers on illegally occupied lands of the Lekwungen and WSÁNEĆ nations. Although I may have my own experiences and Aiden may have her own experiences of violence and insecurity, we cannot speak for Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA people, and instead want to use this as a starting point to further uplift those voices. So first, we're going to be talking about the call to justice and some key terms that are a part of it. So call to justice 15.6 is to protect, support, and promote the safety of women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA people by acknowledging and respecting the value of every person and every community, as well as the right of Indigenous women and girls and 2S LGBTQIA people to generate their own self-determined solutions. In this, we can see that some of the key terms are to protect, to support, to promote, to respect, and self-determination. We see this call as a part of our discussion of human security as outlined in the report. And so we'll be discussing it through this framework.
In defining human security, we center the economic and social interaction of people, especially those who are actively marginalized. The right to security includes the right to life, liberty, and personal safety, as well as control over one's physical, emotional, spiritual, and mental health. In both Indigenous and international definitions of security, both physical and social security are key. The United Nations defines human security into 7 essential dimensions of security. These include health, personal, political, food, environmental, and community security. All these aspects are dynamic and interconnected. Today, we will focus our discussion on economic, personal, environmental, health, and community security as a way to connect human security with self-determination.
So first, I'll be discussing economic security. According to recent surveys, close to 50% of Indigenous women on or off reserve live in poverty. They also have the lowest average annual income and are the most likely to be working part-time jobs to support themselves and or their families. This largely stems from a lack of access to both education and employment. The problems of poverty, education, and employment work in unison, creating an intergenerational cycle. There are several solutions to the issues of economic insecurity facing Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA people today. Many Indigenous women wish to receive better childcare assistance from the government, which would aid women in caring for their children as well as themselves and put less financial strain on the family. Childcare assistance would also aid in the dilemma of teenage Indigenous mothers leaving school in order to work and provide for their children. Higher rates of investment into Indigenous education systems would benefit students living on reserve, allowing them to receive a more well-rounded education and break the cycle of poverty. More accessible schooling would put many more Indigenous children in school.
Personal security is a vital piece of reducing the rates of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA people. Rates of interpersonal family violence are high in Indigenous homes due to intergenerational trauma caused by colonial violence. In order to reduce instances of interpersonal and familial violence in Indigenous homes, healing and unlearning needs to take place. While strategies of harm reduction are important, we believe that no real change can be made until Indigenous men and boys are able to heal and grow from the intergenerational trauma that has been passed on to them through violence, so that the cycle of abuse can come to an end. We see how people of all genders have suffered from the cycle of violence imprinted by colonialism, and we believe that this healing will benefit men and boys, as well as women, girls, and 2SLGBTQQIA people.
So next, I'm going to be talking about environmental security, specifically about housing security. Housing security is a fundamental piece in preventing and addressing violence against Indigenous women, girls, and 2SLGBTQQIA people in Canada. Many places have a lack of affordable housing, which can lead to people being unable to leave violent situations due to financial complications. To address this, it has been suggested that there be more affordable housing built, financed by the government. It has also been suggested that more transitional housing programs be put into place for Indigenous people fleeing domestic violence. To combat the lack of adequate housing in Canada, it can be suggested that there be a committee dedicated to establishing funds for Indigenous communities to do required maintenance on their dwellings, as well as to hire trained professionals to do this work and rebuild as required. It is also essential to create Indigenous-led teams and communities that are tasked with opening more shelter and transitional housing in their communities. They would also be tasked with assisting Indigenous women, girls, and 2SLGBTQQIA people in accessing these services.
As stated in the final report of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, ill health is both a contributing factor to and the result of higher rates of violence against Indigenous women, girls, and 2SLGBTQQIA people. Healthcare facilities on reserves and in remote Indigenous communities are sparse and often are the locations of violent experiences. Many Indigenous communities also lack access to clean water supplies. This is a direct violation of health security as well as environmental and cultural security. Indigenous organizations and authorities need to gain control over these services. We can see this happening in British Columbia. However, the Indigenous women in these situations are still facing discrimination. Now, in order for any of this action to take hold, the Canadian government must participate. Too many promises have been made without the necessary action taken to meaningfully implement change. Current government spending is nowhere near sufficient enough to close the health gap, and provincial and territorial governments continue to allow jurisdictional and interjurisdictional issues to stand in the way.
Finally, I'm going to be talking about community and cultural security. Community and cultural security has the ability to create a reclamation of power and place through connections. We know that colonization aimed to eliminate indigeneity through things including but not limited to residential schools, the 60s Scoop, and the Millennium Scoop, and Indian Act policies. The colonial violence directed towards cultural practice, family, and community creates conditions that increase the likelihood of other forms of violence. This call to justice explicitly names Indigenous women and 2SLGBTQQIA peoples as valued individuals and community members who have solutions to their own issues. Despite this, both the calls to justice and the calls to action outlined in the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, governments remain stagnant in their will to enact change. We need governments and non-Indigenous people to create space for Indigenous communities to enact their self-determination through decision-making, culturally based programs, and Indigenous-led solutions that promote sovereignty.
It is important that institutions and organizations alongside the Canadian government put in the effort to enforce these securities, but we as individuals also have a part to play. Here's a list of Indigenous organizations to support, and here are some resources that we can use to expand your knowledge and become a better ally. We invite everyone watching to look into at least one of these sources and to challenge your understanding of and relationship to the security of Indigenous women, girls, and 2SLGBTQQIA people. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.